Welcome again, and thank you all for joining us. My name is Molly Rogers, and I'm the Associate Director of the Center for the Humanities at New York University. The focus of tonight's event, Writing Maternity, Medicine, Anxiety, Rhetoric, and Genre, is Dreyer Regaignon. I did it, Dara. I messed it up. I said I could do it. I said my French was perfect, and it's not. Dreyer Regaignon book of the same title, which argues that child-rearing advice literature from the early 19th century Britain reflects an historical moment in which maternal care was identified as maternal anxiety. Dara will introduce us to her book, to the argument in her book, and then we will hear from a panel of distinguished respondents. And the ensuing discussion will be moderated by Joe McLaughlin, whom I have the pleasure of introducing. Joe McLaughlin is a second-year MA student in the English department at NYU. He writes on Victorian fiction, queer theory, and avant-garde modernisms. This fall, Joe will be attending the University of Toronto's PhD program in English. Again, thank you all for joining us. And now I hand things over to our moderator, Joe.
Molly, thank you so much for the introduction. I'm really quite honored and excited to be moderating tonight's event, not just because it afforded me the pleasure of reading Dara's book in advance, but also because it helps me celebrate somebody who's been so influential to my own academic journey. So Dara, thank you again and congratulations. Before we begin too, I'd like to just do a land acknowledgement. Although we're virtual today, and we're spread amongst various tribal lands in the United States, I want to acknowledge that I and many others in and around NYU currently reside on the unceded land of the Lenape peoples. I ask you to join me in acknowledging the Lenape community, their elders, both past and present, as well as future generations. NYU acknowledges that it was founded upon exclusions and erasures of many indigenous peoples, including those on whose lands our homes and institution are now located. This acknowledgement demonstrates a commitment to the beginning of process of working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panel. So Dr. Perry Klass is a professor of journalism and pediatrics at NYU. In addition to The Checkup, her weekly column for the New York Times science section, Perry is an author of A Good Time to Be Born, How Science and Public Health Gave Children a Future. She's also the author of myriad books and works of medical journalism and has been featured in The New Yorker, the New England Journal of Medicine, and the Wall Street Journal, among many, many others. She's the winner of the Arnold P. Gold Foundation Humanism in Medicine Award, the Alvarez Award, and the Women's National Book Association Award. Talia Schafer is a professor of English at Queens College and the CUNY Graduate Center. Talia is the author of Romance's Rival, Familiar Marriage in Victorian Fiction, as well as The Forgotten Female Aesthetes and Novel Craft. She was a Lawrence S. Rockefeller Visiting Fellow at Princeton University and is the winner of various academic awards, including the North American Victorian Studies Association's Best Book Prize. Her forthcoming book, Communities of Care, The Social Ethics of Victorian Fiction, comes out this year in 2021. Dylan Dreyer is an associate professor of composition studies at the University of Maine. Dylan is the author of numerous articles in the field of rhetorical genre studies, several of which have won Rhetoric and Writing Studies' most prestigious prizes, including the Richard Braddock Award, the Kenneth Buffy Award, and the Mia Sonessi Prize. His work ranges from rhetorical genre studies to a variety of questions in writing pedagogy and program administration, including questions of assessment, perception, and meaning. He's currently the co-editor of the CWPA Compile Research Bibliographies. And last but not least, Dreyer Regaignon is the associate professor in the English department here at NYU, focused on 19th century British literature and culture, as well as rhetoric and writing studies. She's the co-author of Writing Program Administration at Small Liberal Arts Colleges with Jill Gladstein, as well as Writing Maternity, Medicine, Anxiety, Rhetoric, and Genre. So please put your virtual hands together for our lovely panel.
Thanks, Joe, for that wonderful introduction. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I'm particularly grateful to Talia, Dylan, and Perry for taking the time and sharing their thoughts with me. I also want to thank again the NYU Center for the Humanities and the NYU Working Group on Medical Humanities, which is co-sponsoring this event. I'm going to read a bit from the first chapter of Writing Maternity, the title of which is The Rhetorical Origins of Maternal Anxiety. And my hope is to give you a sense both of sort of the texture of the book and also some of the arc of its argument. I'm going to share my screen in part so that you can be looking with me at the beautiful image that Jordan Wanamaker used to create my cover. So here's the image. In The Physician's Verdict by Belgian painter Émile Caralou-Leclerc, the mother leans forward, her eyes focused on the elderly physician who sits calmly holding her hand. I imagine that the prognosis for the child in the cradle between them is grim. The baby's skin is nearly the same pallor as the white of the pillowcase, although their nose and eyes are swollen, dark, and likely painful. The mother is also pale, and while the girl standing by her side is the picture of health, rosy cheeks, sunlit blonde curls, she too looks serious and concerned. There are no smiles of relief, suggesting a fever lately broken or a dangerous disease avoided. The baby centers the image, connecting family and physician while nearly disappearing into the cradle. The child's illness, the prospect of their death, has already brokered an alliance that renders them nearly irrelevant. The bond between mother and medical man is exclusive. With clasped hands and locked eyes, the two of them could be alone in the room. While the little girl shares her mother's focus on the doctor, the nursemaid looks down at the physical alliance that excludes her from personal involvement in the sick child's care. This seems to be an upper middle class family. The mother's chair is upholstered in red velvet and her dress is silk taffeta. The carpet, the lamp and crystal on the sideboard, and the book carelessly left on the floor further testify to their wealth. The physician also appears wealthy. His top hat and walking stick in the background seem to be of good quality. The black of his suit and the white of his shirt and cravat speak of a life of comparative ease, and therefore the ability of the family to pay his likely considerable fees. The shining white of his linen ties him to the scene. The child's bassinet, the mother's collar, the nursemaid's cap, and the white reflections on the wine glasses above. The reds and the pinks of the family unify them with their room, but he is a visitor. The nurse's blues and browns pull her into the background with the wallpaper. The doctor sits back comfortably in his chair, holding the hand the mother has stretched across the cradle. In profile, he radiates both authority and calm. While the positions of the mother, nursemaid, and girl curve toward the cradle and the sick infant, he sits upright, legs crossed. One hand is captured mid-gesture, emphasizing that our glimpse of the scene is frozen at a moment when the expert answers the mother's anxious question, will my baby live? It seems important to linger momentarily on the nurse who nearly fades into the wallpaper. Standing behind the mother's red velvet chair, she frames the central tableau, eyes downcast and face shadowed. Her arm and shoulder curve into the back of the chair, continuing the line begun by the physician's back and the baby's crib. She appears part of the furnishings that mark the family's wealth and status. But the urgent curve as she cranes over her employer suggests an emotional stake in the doctor's verdict. Her gaze, we can't tell, of course, what the nurse is thinking. Her gaze seems to rest on the clasped hands of her employer and the physician, on an alliance that excludes her. She might be worrying about the child, or be concerned about the extra work the doctor's prescriptions will entail. She might not be thinking about the scene in front of her at all. Distracted by an aching back or feet, she might be wondering when she'll get to sit down for a spell. She might be remembering a similar moment when another child, perhaps her own, lay ill without such a profusion of white linen or expensive expert care. Child-rearing advice literature emerged as a distinct genre in the 1820s and 30s. This development reimagined the relationship between mothers and medical men, physicians, surgeons, and apothecaries, and in doing so, interpolated its maternal readers as ignorant, inexpert, and afraid. What you're seeing right now is my chart graphing this historical emergence based on an archive of 215 advice books that I looked at. The black bars indicate the total number of books published in a particular decade, while the striped bars are indicating publications that newly appeared in that decade. This was a genre that had a lot of reissuing and updating and subsequent editions. So I only count a single title once in the new publication column when it first appeared, but it'll get counted multiple times over the course of the decades as it reappeared in the black bars. But what I really want you to just get the visual of is like this boom in the 1820s and that starts then. So in confidently elevating emergent medical knowledge about child illness and well baby care over the experiential wisdom of female caregivers, this genre not only contributed significantly to the development of pediatrics as a medical specialty, but also participated in a sentimentalized idealization of motherhood that simultaneously elevated its symbolic importance and evacuated it of all but moral authority. Operating by rhetorically cultivating uncertainty and self-doubt in its addressees, the genre invokes an anxious reader, an anxious maternal subjectivity. I'm using anxiety in ways that are both commonsensical and quite specific, to indicate generalized low-level fear and to index the specific bodily and emotional relations to time and space that theorists have located in that term. The emotion in my usage has two particularly important features. First, following a strain of psychoanalytic thinking influenced by Sigmund Freud, that it puts the body in a specific temporality in which future possibilities or dangers are experienced in the present moment and on the basis of previous experience or knowledge. In other words, part of the experience of anxiety is a kind of temporal overload in which past and future are compressed into the present. Second, following a philosophical trajectory partially indebted to Søren Kierkegaard, that anxiety inheres in the experience and movement of choice, the juxtaposition of and selection between multiple possibilities. These two frameworks intersect in important ways, as when the consideration of different prognoses for an ill child requires forecasting a range of future possible outcomes in order to make a treatment decision in the present moment, or when a narrative telos depends on the simultaneous progression of different plots. In addition, it's essential to my understanding that anxiety is relational, as Sarah Ahmed has theorized emotions more broadly. It inheres neither in a particular individual, an anxious person, nor in particular objects. That makes me anxious, but in the movement of scene and situation itself. Furthermore, like Ahmed, I'm interested in how social norms become affective over time. In chapter 2, I use this understanding of genre to offer the first rhetorical genre analysis of child-rearing advice literature. There, I contend that anxiety is a significant uptake of advice literature because of how the genre constitutes its rhetorical situation and exigence. In other words, the possibilities and constraints encoded for maternal readers by child-rearing advice literature associate anxiety with the scene of mothering. My question in this chapter then is not whether or not the consumers of child-rearing advice literature took up the doctor's prescriptions and, for example, lanced their teething baby's gums as advised. It is how the increasing barrage of expert medical advice shaped how motherhood was imagined and its consequent emotional horizons. I adapt genre ecology analysis for rhetorical literary historiography by focusing on the relations between advice literature, memoir, and domestic fiction. Following chapter 2's detailed analysis of advice literature, chapters 3, 4, and 5 take up specific topics that genre makes especially sticky or particularly saturated with cause for concern. The likelihood of infants and children dying in chapter 3, the supplemental presence of paid caregivers in chapter 4, and the persistent rumor that such paid caregivers might dose babies with opium. In each of these chapters, I consider how the topic circulates through the genre ecology of Victorian motherhood, as I call it. My analyses emphasize generic affordances and consider what these formally and rhetorically patterned representations contribute to a broader discursive, that is, intertextual, intergeneric, and intersubjective situation. In chapter 3, I emphasize the temporality of anxiety. I argue that 19th century representations of infant and child death operate by a proleptic logic, importing future probable tragedy into the present emotional moment. Little Nell's death in Charles Dickens's The Old Curiosity Shop offers the paradigmatic example of this. Advice literature takes up and transforms this suspenseful logic, affording motherhood as a kind of statistical stress through its relentless association of the aggregated likelihood of babies and children dying with maternal ignorance. This narrative patterning is then reinforced and extended in the writing of mothers watching their children die. Child death is thus an imminent and yet perpetually postponed narrative telos that is statistically probable, a proleptically experienced tragedy that defines maternal experience through her doomed responsibility to prevent it, and an access of emotional identification across classes. By tying maternal identity to the preservation of child health, life, and morals, these genres thus work individually and in concert to attach the nurturing temporality of mother love to the fearful temporality of anxiety. I then shift focus from temporal to spatial dimensions. In chapter 4, I turn to questions of employment, race, and social class by taking up advice literature's persistent suspicion that paid caregivers might not be or be doing precisely what they are hired for. By focusing on the servants who provide quote unquote maternal care, governesses and wet nurses, as paid employees, I draw attention to the role of feeling in domestic management, predicated upon the possibility, if not likelihood, that all is not as it seems, and that the individual women hired to deliver childcare will do so with their own insights, values, and perspectives. This formation produces anxiety as the emotion that maintains elite women's attention on and in the home. I juxtapose memoir and advice literature with 3 novels of the 1840s that feature paid caregivers: Anne Bronte's Agnes Grey, Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, and Charles Dickens's Dombey and Son. Together, these literary texts extend and deepen the spatialized attention advice literature and memoir cultivate by drawing attention to the impossibility of erasing employees' individual cultures, memories, values, and desires. Questions of death collide with questions of supervision in chapter 5. I examine how warnings that paid caregivers would dose babies with opium or opiate-based patent medicines figure the middle-class home as porous, perpetually on the verge of extinguishing itself by the very structures on which it relies for social and physical reproduction. Emphasizing opium's role as a common medicine, exploitative and illegal global commodity, and synecdoche for class and racial difference, I show how the repetition of this warning across all 3 genres extends the vision of anxious maternity as never-ending supervision that I developed in chapter 4. Chapter 5 thus identifies the perhaps paradoxical reproductivity of maternal anxiety. Rather than marking the neurosis or failure of particular women, this emotion is precisely attached to the arrangement and control over temporal and spatial processes that is the managerial role in the neoliberal economy. Focusing the attention of those who identify as mothers on the future of the child and the space of the domestic sphere, maternal anxiety is an essential affective component of the patriarchal capitalism of empire, engineering its production and reproduction through genres and generations. When did mothers start worrying so much? Why do they keep worrying so? Writing Maternity seeks to answer these intertwined questions by offering a rhetorical literary history of maternal anxiety. While I'm confident that mothers worried well before the turn of the 19th century, the felt sense that good mothering must involve worry rose to dominance with the rise of the middle class and is attached to its various material conditions. Maternal anxiety, as we will see, is complicit in reproductive futurism's relentless figuration of the fragile child to enact the political, and in global capitalism's exploitative faith that some bodies and babies are more valuable than others. Emerging at a time when the child is newly figured as both precious and vulnerable, the anxious mother is overwhelmed, not simply by too many choices right now, but also the future implications of each decision. The persistent stickiness of mother and worry develops not simply through the emergence of a single genre, but through intergeneric circulations that iteratively constitute different versions of an anxious rhetorical situation that is nonetheless the same, arranging subjects, objects, and exigencies in ways that attach the emotion to the cultural formation. Advice literature, life writing, and narrative fiction circulate topics and forms, borrowing, repurposing, shifting, extending, and repatterning the rhetorical situation of motherhood, naturalizing its affect, and collapsing the imagined and experiential differences between care and concern. Thank you.
Thank you, Dara, so much. Next up, we have Perry Class.
Thank you so much for the chance to talk. I want to start by congratulating Dara and saying how proud and honored I am to be asked to speak, and what a remarkable and interesting book, and what a remarkable and interesting book for a pediatrician to read, especially perhaps a pediatrician who is actually in the business of writing columns for parents. And I will say that not only did your book make me think differently about history and literature, but it made me think a lot about some of the daily issues which actually come up in clinical practice, in daily conversations with families around worry, around anxiety. And since I'm going to talk in particular about scarlet fever, I'm going to start by telling you a story out of my own history, in which many years ago, practicing at a neighborhood health center in Boston, a grandmother had brought in a baby, and I proudly, not a baby, a toddler, and I proudly made the diagnosis of scarlet fever. She was an immigrant, she was Spanish speaking, and I was super proud not only of diagnosing the illness, but also of knowing the Spanish word for scarlet fever, which I, again, cheerfully, proudly announced, and she started to cry. And I think of scarlet fever as a very easily treatable disease. Here's some penicillin. And I'm afraid New in Practice saw this as an example of my diagnostic cleverness. I had identified it, I could treat it. She, coming from a country where medical care was less available and where infant and child mortality was more of a reality, heard it as a terrifying word. And I've thought about that interaction many times in many different ways, both from my perspective and her perspective, but you've given me reason to think again about the ways that anxiety, personal history, and context all come into play. It's also, I'll just say that in a week in which we're sort of talking about nothing so much as about vaccines, which is a constant conversation in pediatrics, again, the question of are we engendering anxiety? Are we reassuring? Should we be engendering more anxiety? How do we find ways to address risk and anxiety in realistic ways? It's an everyday exam room question and an everyday question that comes up around what is now called messaging. I want to bring in my discipline. I want to admit to the limitations and deficiencies of reading as a doctor, in which I read your brilliant third chapter on probability and premature death with the constant feeling of, oh, if only we had penicillin, which is really not a particularly helpful way to read your complicated and lucid readings, but also thinking, I think, in terms of a phrase that Dara uses, which really struck me, in which child death, child mortality is written about and thought about as, quote, foreordained but preventable. And thinking about that in the context of a time in which there was, no matter how medically trained or scientific you were, scarlet fever was a mystery. Louis Pasteur would not identify the bacterium, group A streptococci, until 1879. He would identify it as the bacteria which caused puerperal fever, which it does. It also causes strep throat. It also causes scarlet fever. It's a bacterium which makes a toxin which can turn you red. And one of the things I thought about with that was the relationship to what must have been some component of anxiety which started in pregnancy, approaching labor and delivery at a time when that also carried a kind of personal risk. And I wondered how that played in to the anxiety as transferred to a child's life. But you know, the narratives, people who've studied the history both of childbirth and of childbed fever have uncovered remarkable narratives of women facing birth and facing some of the odds and the problems that they faced, and also fascinating narratives, at least to me, by some of the physicians worrying over whether these rumors that it could actually be something that doctors carried with them could possibly be true. So up until the 1870s, certainly there was not even an organism. Scarlet fever, which is caused by a toxin, which would not be understood until well after that. Such a powerful presence, both in history and in literature. The most famous literary case of scarlet fever, of course, is in Little Women, when Beth catches scarlet fever by going in her saintly way to take care of a sick baby in a poor German immigrant's family. Almost too good to be true, and yet it was true. It was how Louisa May Alcott's sister Elizabeth actually did come down with scarlet fever. And like Beth in the book, she's very sick, she almost dies. She recovers, but then she died a couple of years later, both in the real Alcott family and then also in the book, of what is, I think, pretty clearly the sequelae of scarlet fever, rheumatic heart disease, again, something that would not be understood for many years. So this sense of foreordained but preventable in a world in which the actual causes are mysterious, I think stayed with me as I was reading the book, along with that sense, not just of the way that scarlet fever turns up in literature, in children's books, from Little Women to The Velveteen Rabbit. If you remember in The Velveteen Rabbit, that classic of children's literature from the 1920s, the boy, who's only called the boy, gets scarlet fever, and the doctor says you have to burn all his stuff, including his precious stuffed rabbit, because it's a mass of germs. So here we are in the 1920s, we have the word germs, we know how the disease is spread, but there's still nothing else that the doctor can do besides send the boy to the seaside and demand that his stuffed animals be burned. I was reminded reading about Catherine Tate and loss of her children and the detail in which she describes taking care of them. I was reminded of Charles Darwin's letters when he describes taking care of his daughter Annie, who dies in 1851, perhaps from scarlet fever. There are different theories. The Darwin family will then lose a son a few years later, also to scarlet fever. Reminded of the way the disease affects Gustav Mahler, who loses a daughter and perhaps dies himself of the cardiac effects, and reminded of the way that the Rockefeller Institute is founded by John D. Rockefeller when his beloved grandson dies in 1901 at the age of 3 from scarlet fever. And it's actually at that institute that researchers, including Dr. Rebecca Lansfield, will tease out some of this detail. Anyway, I just want to close then by noting what I think was a really interesting tension between something that you quote Mrs. Sherwood saying, quote, "Every mother or father possesses a sort of instinctive persuasion that his child is to outlive him," and something which was written by Dr. Rebecca Lee Crumpler, the first Black woman to earn a medical degree in the United States, who published a book of medical discourses in 1883, in which she wrote, "Children are given to parents only for a lifetime. It may be long or it may be very short." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Perry. Next, I'd like to introduce Talia Schafer.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me? Is the volume okay? Great, thank you. So I want to thank Joe for moderating and Dara for inviting me to be on this panel. It's really an honor to be speaking here about this magnificent book. And like Perry, I was particularly thrilled to get an advanced copy of it, get to read it. I thought today what I would do is just give you a sense of what it feels like to read this book as a Victorianist and a Victorianist who has worked on family history and marital history. What are the things that I learned from it and how does it fit into the field? And maybe give you a few other things in case people out there want to read more stuff like this. Although there's, as I'm going to say, there's not very much that's exactly like this. So Dreyer Regagnon's writing Maternity adds significantly to our grasp of women's domestic lives in Victorian England. And when I say it adds significantly, what I mean is actually that it kind of slides around the side, insinuates itself into spaces we hadn't noticed were there, overlays the terrain that we thought we had recognized. Regagnon's book doesn't add a new thing so much as it fundamentally redefines the way we see everything. Because in Victorian studies, we knew some things already. We knew that domestic advice manuals were a new popular genre in the early to mid 19th century, and we knew that they derived from recipe collections, medical treatises, and conduct literature. We also knew that Victorians sentimentalized children and idealized maternal feeling, and we tended to think that usually started with Rousseau and became a big deal in the 19th century. When we thought about why this mattered, our answers tended to focus on social changes. We thought that the advice manual testified to the emergence of a middle class that defined itself according to moral probity, including hard work, earnestness, piety, domestic harmony. The emergence of this genre also revealed the development of a readership that was literate but uncertain of how to behave, a newly class mobile and perhaps geographically mobile readership that turned to publications to guide them through lives that were unlike their parents and that they had perhaps moved away from those parents. But Regagnon's work does not assume readers' pre-existing sociological status. Instead, she deduces how this genre produced its readers, how it taught readers to regard themselves as dangerously incompetent and therefore needing these books' authoritative pronouncements. And I have to say, I had never been aware of how sociologically we were reading advice manuals until I read Dara's book. And I was like, oh, seeing that there's another way to read this has made me recognize our strongly sociological analysis before this. So in Regagnon's words, this genre, quote, interpolated its maternal readers as ignorant, inexpert, and afraid, end quote, participating in, quote, a sentimentalized idealization of motherhood that simultaneously elevated its symbolic importance and evacuated it of all but moral authority. So I want to just show you how this book participates in what I think of as some of the most important and interesting moments or developments in Victorian studies today. And I want to start with Temporality Studies, which is actually so new. It's not really called that. I don't think it even has a name yet. It's the analysis of different temporal rhythms of daily life in the 19th century, and it derives from work in queer temporality and crypt time. There's a brand new issue of SAQ, South Atlantic Quarterly, about temporalities. If you're interested in this, it's so new I haven't seen it yet, but it came out like yesterday. But if you want to find some books on this, Maria Damker's Time, Domesticity, and Print Culture notes how cookbooks structure domestic temporality in terms of discontinuity, habit, repetition, and interruption. And Megan Ward's Seeming Human reads domestic realism as a kind of feedback loop, operating as a routinized self-regulatory apparatus where you just repeat yourself all the time and regulate how you do domesticity. Regagnon's analysis adds to this emerging temporal genre because she specifies that maternal anxiety is both proleptic, anticipating future catastrophe, and paralyptic, invoking alternatives precisely by denying them. In its fixation on fearful futurity and in its terrified attentiveness to contemporaneous alternatives, maternity becomes mired in an impossible temporal rhythm, never fully present to itself. Second, Regaignon participates in a new generation of digital humanities work that takes the processing of big data sets as part of its mission, rather than the whole of its identity. And you saw this in that wonderful chart. She's working with 215 child-rearing advice texts published between 1740 and 1860. And this corpus enables her to analyze the pace and number of new publications, the extent to which each text borrowed from others, and the alterations in different editions over time. The third thing I'm noting here is that this book is really admirably steeped in issues of race and empire. Regaignon gives due emphasis to the racial alterity ascribed to Indian nurses, and she analyzes the rhetoric about opium-laced soothing syrups. And I just pulled out one example, just so you can hear the richness of this analysis, the way it's sort of hitting on every cylinder at once. It's just amazing that she's able to write this way. So here, this is a quote. This symbolically dense substance, this is the opium-laced soothing syrup, this symbolically dense substance it carries with it histories of military aggression and both agricultural and economic exploitation. Opium is therefore always simultaneously a medicine, a poison, an orientalized and habit-forming intoxicant, a working-class palliative, and the exploitative economic foundation of Britain's global dominance. In these warnings, the substance concretizes the alterity of paid childcare in British homes wherever they may be located. I just kind of wanted to applaud when I read that. That's like 5 things at once there. Finally, I want to point out how good Regaignon's timing is. This timing is perfect because her book has appeared at almost the exact same time as Tamara Silvio Wagner's The Victorian Baby in Print, which came out in 2020. So these 2 books appearing together are opening up a new era of research on the discursive constructs of family in the 19th century. And I actually, after I read Regaignon's book, I went back and reread Wagner's book, and the resonances are just amazing. Both address childcare manuals, the fiction of Charles Dickens and Charlotte Young, the sentimentalization of mothers and infants, and middle-class anxieties about paid childcare providers and opiates. But they're doing it differently. Wagner focuses on the infant, where Regaignon looks at the mother. So they really produce complementary emphases. And I read the 2 chapters on Charlotte Young next to each other, and it's like they're puzzle pieces that fit in together. So I think the fact that these 2 books have come out, people are going to look back and say, this is the moment when this field really opened up with these 2 books. Just to give you one example, as you've heard, Regaignon is focusing on maternal anxiety. Wagner talks about competitive parenting. So a different kind of anxiety, you know, the mother next door, how are you doing next to the mother next door? But you can see how these 2 would resonate with each other. But I want to end today by pointing out something I loved about Regaignon's book, and that is all her own. Her pursuit of what she calls, quote, diffuse, oblique, rhizomatic, and circulatory connections, overlaps, and sedimentations among the various genres she addresses here. So one example that particularly impressed me is she talks about the old curiosity shop and how it heightens readerly anxiety, both because Quilp emerges unpredictably. He's the villain, you never know when he's going to pop up. So that increases your anxiety as a reader, but also the rhythm of serial publication, which introduces long gaps where the reader doesn't know how little Nell is doing, what her condition is, whether she's alive or dead. So I thought that was a really sensitive way to think about the way people talk about the old curiosity shop in terms of sentiment, but to talk about it in terms of the production of anxiety through these formal and formatting kind of issues was, I thought, a really great insight. Regaignon writes, quote, I am interested in the ways advice literature, memoir, and fiction read and reread one another from a distance, working in stochastic concert to iteratively develop, perpetuate, and normalize the subject position of anxious mother, end quote. So today I've been talking about the ways that Regaignon's book enriches our field as it resonates with some of Victorian studies' most exciting new directions, but the subtlety and sophistication of the critical method of writing maternity makes it a new kind of critical work, one that models how to read across multiple genres towards a central core idea. Regaignon gives us a mother who is literally beside herself, out of time, desperate to save the babies she is already expecting to lose. The story of the production of the anxious mother simultaneously across multiple genres is a tragedy, but the book that tells us about it is a triumph. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Talia. I now want to introduce our last member of the panel, Dylan Dreyer.
Thank you, Joe. Writing maternity addresses a particular need that we have in rhetorical genre studies, and I would say intellectual life broadly. That is a need for meticulous causal analyses of dominant cultural formations. I just shouted out to Raymond Williams there, and I will call back to him at the very end of this. Maternal anxiety, in the particularly inchoate and irresolvable form that Dreyer diagnoses, and which most of us have either experienced directly or have certainly been adjacent to it, is quite frankly, a blight. It transmogrifies parental affection, nurture, support into a kind of homeostat that no matter what else is going right, which is most things most of the time, after all, always seems to reset itself back to this kind of state of chronic fretfulness. It's very helpful to have this homeostat historicized, understanding that it comes from a particular confluence of historical and material conditions means understanding that it could have been different, and it doesn't have to be that way now, because this homeostat is extraordinarily powerful. Anxiousness is continuously producing new technologies to assuage itself, and which for the most part simply provide new vectors for that anxiety. Baby monitors, live streams from daycares, upgrades to last month's car seat, and so on. Many of us, upon being confronted by our quest to purchase some superfluous bit of technology or subscribe to some pointless extra precaution, have felt the enormous pressure to not seem cavalier or callous, when what we could feel is simply an exercise of common sense. But for Dreier's work, we could assume that that sense was never common. But now we can see that we do not, in fact, have to live like this. More on that momentarily. Given where I sit in rhetorical genre studies, my attention, predictably goes to the mundane documents. It is commonly said, of course, and this I think is one of our central insights in rhetorical genre studies, it is commonly said that genres arise in recurrent situations. But what we know is that the existence of a genre makes situations appear similar, even when they are not. So I found for this reason the dissection of the advice manual very instructive. So the retroflexive nature of genre makes simple chronologies difficult. Did medical practitioners respond to a market for advice, or did they create the market in order to respond to it? The demand for what, though, seems to be not very helpful. It's a demand to consult and to be consulted, but never to provide a solution. At best, a temporary scratch that exacerbates the itch to consult. These collections, which appear primarily to conjure up edge case scenarios or to turn prosaic issues into edge cases, for these 19th century and 21st century mothers, simply increase the anxiety about what other information there must be. A temporary reassurance that quickly becomes its own accelerant to further aggravation. Dreyer is generous, I think, in her reading of what she calls the circulation and reproduction of earlier authors' language and anecdotes. She sees this kind of repackaging of anecdotes as a means by which an authoritative medical community is perpetuated. They may also have plagiarized from each other so much because there really wasn't all that much to say, which in turn suggests that maybe there wasn't really all that much to know. To take up one of these books, though, is effectively to surrender that there is knowledge that you need or might need but don't already have. It creates the sensation there are things that you don't know. And of course, since a negative is impossible to disprove, it then goes on to suggest that there are things that you didn't know you don't know, which traps you in a double negative that's doubly impossible to disprove. We want to be careful about confusing effects with intentions here, but honestly, the remedy seems almost malevolently designed to perpetuate itself. As Dreyer shows, it's marked by a rhetoric of subordination that emphasizes a mother's helplessness in the face of her awesome responsibility. It's marked by a narrative trajectory that seems always to end in death as a direct result of failing to heed advice. It's marked by a singular aggressivity that makes mothers feel alone with their responsibility, yet the advice itself is inconsistent and contradictory. So what's a mother to do? She would have to employ the very expertise that the advice won't allow her to have in order to decide which advice manuals to ignore. Because the authors of these books themselves appear to be free associating, fevers over here and death trap cradles over there and shiftless nannies over there, they just leak anxiety into every maternal scene. The precedent for our modern time is compelling. If we move to the present, in which the genre has changed some of its trappings but not its substance, we see how this fretful interiority seeps into other genres, both public, mommy blogs, Amazon product reviews, stock characters in TV shows, and private as well, physician referral letters, ouch reports from daycares, texts with siblings, all projecting a future for the child in which the intimate advice of medical men and women will probably continue to be inevitable. Dreher's concluding move in this wonderful book is very smart, is very productive. So having operationalized advice as a kind of social action, that is a genre, she then flips it, asking us to think of genre as a kind of advice. Genres generate possibilities as well as sets of interactions among feelings, beliefs, and experiences. So hearing advice, you're already constrained by the time you recognize the advice as such. The uptakes that are available to you, which include resistance and scorn, of course, are necessarily already in interaction with the genre and your own, as she says, layers of memory and experience. So in sum, I would say, what we have here in this book is actually a perfect illustration of what Dreyer, I think, too modestly suggests may someday be possible. That is, the book is in fact an illustration of how systems, structures, and forms mediate between individual experience and memory on the one hand, and cultural knowledge and memory on the other, unquote. I would love to be able to drop this study in amongst others of similar specificity and quality to assemble a mosaic, a sweeping view of the textual production of the modern self. And I hope the University of Ohio Press is listening. One question then. Dreyer concludes with the hope that we can now, quote, identify ways to shift maternal anxiety from its fearful, threatened sense of obstructed agency and toward the planful, anticipatory logics that can enact revolutionary change, unquote. Me too. As we know, though, ideological formations are generally not susceptible to reason or evidence. And for that reason, I'm curious about the potential of what we might call advice fatigue. For such moments of resistance that we see in Laditan's Facebook post that serves as the epigraph for the manuscript, or 30 years earlier, Roseanne Barr's remarking, "You're going to screw them up no matter what you do, so you might as well just live your life." As Raymond William reminds us, the hegemonic never completely exhausts the totality of lived experience. There are always ways and practices outside the hegemonic. Scorn and resistance, of course, and so-called free-range parenting comes to mind as a deliberately oppositional stance, but also in just plain old obliviousness to, and what we might call insouciance with, the hegemonic demands to be anxious. The latter, I think, seems a productive place to focus, for in insouciance and in being otherwise, other uptakes become gradually more possible. The more we take them up, the more possible they become for others. Thank you for inviting me and the chance to respond to this brilliant and highly useful work.
Dylan, thank you so much. Now, if we have no objections, I'd like to move to a series of moderated questions. This will be about 15 minutes or so, and then we can open up the space for public audience questions. If anyone has questions, please put them into the Q&A, and I'll sort through them and start asking the panel. Okay, so I wanted to start something off here by asking about the methodological approach of this book. One of the most immediately notable things about the book is that it's rooted in rhetorical genre studies. The book thinks about text and genre in this really refreshing way. So I want to ask the panel, especially Dreyer and Dylan, about what uptake affordances and genre ecology can do for historicizing a kind of text within a period, and what it means to unsettle assumptions surrounding the power of text over an audience.
That's a great question. I think for me that actually gets at sort of what rhetorical genre studies did for me in working on this, which was that I got really stuck figuring out how to read advice literature, how to connect the advice literature, which I wanted to take really seriously as a genre, with literature, with novels. And it was like there was this like impasse, and I couldn't figure out how to make the kinds of claims of interaction that I wanted to without looking for things like direct references or that kind of thing that weren't apparent. Like, so I felt like they were connecting, and I didn't have the language to figure it out. And so for me, the concept of uptake and the notion that any particular genre is already interactive and is already creating a space for response that is constrained and yet capacious gave me a way to start thinking about that, and a way to start looking for different kinds of resonances and connections and conversation between texts than I had felt like I could do before with just sort of tools from literary studies. I guess, so that opened up one thing, and then the idea of a genre ecology, which comes from Clay Spinuzzi's work, further opened it up for me, because part of what he does is he shows how individuals are not using genres in the way the genres seem to intend or want to be used. And I'm not focused on individual users, but that also opened up a much more chaotic, serendipitous, stochastic kind of interaction between them that I think you can really start to see historically without some of the direct references. I do feel as though part of my challenge, part of what made me feel when I was writing this book that I was constantly trying to reach just beyond my like intellectual fingertips to name things, was that a lot of the time when this gets done in rhetorical genre studies, it's done around contemporary work. And so you can like interview people or observe them and figure out what they're doing with these genres. And I can't do that. The people are dead. They can't tell me what they were thinking about this. And so I felt as though some of this looseness in the way the concepts of rhetorical genre theory were working gave me a way to like name things and bring them into conversation, but also do justice to some of that kind of that play.
I think I just would add to that, to go back to the concept of affordance, which is really interestingly deployed in this book, is to show us a kind of a tactical side, if we're interested in reform, if we're interested in doing something about the phenomenon, which I hope we are, shows us not only that users can be resistant to the sort of uptakes the genre holds out to them, but also shows us sites for intervention. And they don't have to be drastic ones. We can talk about tweaking or adjusting the kinds of uptakes a genre might hold out to reviewers, which could transform their entire engagement with a situation that they may or may not perceive to be recurring.
Thank you. That's so interesting. And just to echo what Dylan says too, there's a point that Dreyer has in the book that I love where she says, remember, advice can be taken, laughed at, or deliberately ignored. So I think that that's a really great point to bring out. I also wanted to ask, this is a very general question, but it's about infant mortality. So early in the book, Dreyer traces how maternal advice literature emerged kind of synchronously with the medicalization of childcare. And in fact, one of the largest causes for maternal anxiety was a high rate of infant mortality in the 19th century. So I wanted to ask the panel generally about infant mortality now and then, and its connection to maternal anxiety. So although we have lower rates of child and infant mortality today, anxiety still seems to be a cornerstone for middle-class maternal feeling.
I'll say a word about that because it's, I think, a very good point. We live now in a world, and I don't just mean in a country, I mean to an increasingly large extent in a world, although there are disparities and there are countries where things are worse. But even so, overall, globally, we live in a world where infant mortality is down at levels which would have been, quite frankly, hard for my grandmother to believe when she was having her children in Brooklyn in, the early part of the 20th century. And so a couple of points to make about infant mortality today. First of all, in this country, infant mortality, as you know, is the number of children born alive who die before the first birthday. So calculating that on a comparative basis, first of all, means counting the children born alive. And if you look in the 19th century and even at the beginning of the 20th, that's often not a denominator that you have available. Nobody's counting the children born alive. What you're told instead is X% of the deaths in a certain city or a certain borough are babies. And of course, the problem is as a percent of the deaths, that means if more grown-ups die, the percent of the deaths that's babies goes down. So, good news, there were very high rates of tuberculosis this year among the adults. So the percentage of, so that's a very hard way to compare. So anyway, infant mortality, that number of deaths out of 1,000, we think at the beginning of the 20th century was somewhere up above 100 out of every 1,000 children born alive didn't make it to their first birthdays. Dara, do you think that's okay? Are you all right with that as a number? And where we are now in this country is somewhere under 7 out of every 1,000. Two comments to make about that. First of all, there are countries that have it down to more like 2 out of every 1,000. We by no means, lead the list. And 2, there are marked and persistent disparities in this country. The infant mortality rate, like the maternal mortality rate in this country, is persistently elevated to the point of being double in the African American community, in the Native American. It's different by groups, and those disparities have remained persistent even as the overall rate came down. So but counting this way really only goes back to the beginning of the 20th century, and counting everybody this way and using this as a measuring stick to compare countries and how are we doing and how are we taking care of our youngest citizens. But the point you make, which is that although in all groups the rate has come down so dramatically, we don't have any reason to think that the anxiety, it's possible that the locus of the anxiety has shifted. It's possible that the sense of responsibility has shifted. It's possible, I've argued that it may have become more intense because we no longer, all of the sort of the classic 1906 book, Infant Mortality, A Social Problem, tells you on page 1 that no matter what you're going to do, the young of all species are especially vulnerable. There's a certain sense that no matter what you do, you're going to lose a certain number, even though we're going to try to drive that number down. And of course, we now live in an era, both as medical practitioners and as parents and as a populace, in which we do not believe that there are acceptable losses.
I think I would just add that, I think I agree with Perry that once you could stop worrying about whether or not your child was going to die, you just, the anxiety just attached itself to a new thing. It didn't, or, all the new things in a sense. And some of that may be that in hypercapitalism, we have more and more choices to make, right? And anxiety inheres in the scene of choice and the consequences of those choices. I feel sometimes thinking about Dylan's question of how do we get out of this mess, that there's a value in sort of not investigating all the choices. There's a value in not embracing that kind of market logic that saturates sort of, and just sort of, going with the common sense or the something easier or the something more straightforward. That's not necessarily the answer. And I like the idea of play or insouciance or some other kind of more disruptive force better as a way to get out of it. But I feel as though there's something both intensifying and mobile at this point. I feel in what I was observing in the 19th century, it seemed that a lot of the anxiety was attaching to a relatively controllable set of scenarios. There was questions about moral development. There were the questions of death and paid childcare and opium that I was mentioning, but it felt as though it was a little bit less like every single decision might mean that your kid is going to grow up stupid or not connected to you, or some of these other kinds of things that I feel like are the form it takes now.
Because the form of the advice was in a particular crucible of a historical moment where the medical practitioners were probably keenly aware of how little, for the first time, particularly keenly aware of how little they knew. We know now vastly much more than they did. But the genre persists, and it persists in that tone, and it persists minutely targeted on that particular anxiety, such that even though we know so much more and have brought these mortality rates down so far, the anxiety is perfectly recognizable.
I think that what Dara said, speaks to that idea that we, in a setting in which we are not parents are not necessarily so worried about making a mistake and therefore a child will die, the question of making a mistake and the child is in the wrong classroom becomes invested with a sort of, get it wrong and ruin your child's life, even in an extreme. I mean, I wonder if our grandparents or even our parents felt that same level of make or break decision making attendant on, small interactions and decisions.
I'm also thinking it might be good to just remember that it wasn't only the doctors who were producing this anxiety. I mean, that's one of the points of Dara's book. Dara, you talk about one of these manuals that was actually produced by a grandmother who is sort of saying, I'm a grandmother and this is the source of my authority. But you're pointing out that it occurs across fiction, journalism, everywhere. So it's not, I mean, it's tempting to say, well, maybe the doctors didn't know, they thought they knew all this stuff and they were but they didn't really know it and they were compensating for it. I don't know, my sense of Victorian doctors is that they didn't know how much they didn't know, and they were perfectly fine with projecting way more authority than we feel they should have had at any moment. But I think the authority was being projected across the board, and often, like one of the things I learned from Dara's book is that often the anxiety is being produced not in the moments of the expression of authority, but in the silences and the gaps of serialization, or in the unpredictability of when a character will occur, or in the way a character in a novel will develop, so when you're not armored against it, when you're not like, I have to be insouciant when I read this, that's the moment they get to you, right? It worms its way into your brain when you think, I'm just going to lie back and read a novel. That's when they get you.
It's the insouciance vaccine.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of what, Talia, thank you for that. That was part of what the novels in part were bringing for me, is that these connections weren't all being made in this single genre, or even in the interaction between advice literature and memoir, which was sort of the most sort of direct set of uptakes I could see. Like they were in more direct conversation with one another. But the ways in which some of these associations were getting connected to one another in other forms, right? Little Nell is 14 years old. She's not a child, right? And yet she was taken up in the popular imagination as incredibly young and vulnerable. And so her death was operating in some of those ways. But I'm also thinking that when I look at Jane Eyre and Agnes Grey, which are fictional autobiographies, like part of what they're dramatizing is the fact that governess who is in your house and teaching your children, and who is supposed to have no opinions about anything ever, much less critical ones, has opinions, because of course she has opinions, and she has a life story with a past and a trajectory and a set of desires, and that's part of it, right? So it's not just that you're being told over here, be careful of the governess, or here's how to handle your governess so that she won't have opinions of your own. It's also that then, you're picking up something else and you're like, oh crap, they have opinions. And I care about this individual. I'm reading this novel and I really care about what's going to happen to her. Oh crap, this is, and then it's like, it's all reinforcing those dangers, I guess.
Thank you so much. I also have a question that I wanted to ask about, this is about vulnerability and empire, because one of the most important aspects about theorizing the family is the family's reproductive role within the context of nation and empire. I'm just going to read a small snippet from Dara's text early on. She writes, by attaching this fearful, watchful emotion to the economic and racial conditions of middle-class child rearing, this ecology of genres focuses female attention on the domestic sphere as the vulnerable center of the current and future nation. So I want to ask the panel to reflect about anxiety and vulnerability as national feelings and their political significance, past and present.
So that's a really interesting question, because a lot of Britishness was about projecting invulnerability, and we can beat anybody. We could beat the French with, one British person can take out 10 French people or whatever. People in the Sudan are no problem for us. And of course, that was continually threatened. So I think Charlotte Bronte, just to pick up one novelist that Dara works with, was very concerned about this, the idea of Britishness as invulnerability and international and global strength, which, coexisted, especially in Villette, in her last novel, coexisted very uncertainly with the experience of the British person abroad, who felt vulnerable and, extremely attackable, and was constantly being condemned for being English. The other thing you have to remember is that at mid-century, there was a new racial theorizing, it was called racial science, that tried to divide the world into kind of tribes or groups that only mapped very roughly onto nations. And so you had to sort of figure out what race you were in, and that race was immutable, and that race determined everything about you. So if you were scared and you were from one particular race, using race in quotation marks, because the British, like the Victorian understanding of race, which is not like our modern understanding of race, that scaredness might be part of your racial identity. So that if you're a British person and you're scared, maybe you're not really British in some way, So it's a complicated situation. The idea of being vulnerable and being British. But I do just want to say one more thing. There's this amazing thing by Mrs. Ernest Jones, which is, I'm forgetting, I think it's like the Jingo, or it's like the Imperialist Babies ABC or something like that. And it's literally an ABC to train children up to be imperialists, where it's like N is for the Navy, and, all the things you can celebrate about being British. So it wasn't natural. It wasn't innate. It was, except if it was racially, it was a thing that also had to be taught and inculcated. So I think it's a really complicated situation, but I think also Dara probably knows more about it than I do.
I was just thinking, I'm so excited about that ABC. I didn't know about it. And it was reminding me, one of my sort of, I guess, invisible entry points to this project was working on Mary Martha Sherwood's fiction. So Sherwood was a really important evangelical children's author in the first half of the 19th century. And one of her famous stories, called Little Henry and His Bearer, was about a little boy little white boy orphaned in British India, living with a memsahib who totally neglects him and just leaves him to the care of the servants. And so he develops a relationship with the servant, who is his bearer, that is one of parent and child. And the little boy dresses like an Indian. He speaks Hindi. He is worshiping alongside his bearer. And then lovely young woman fresh off the boat from England comes and is horrified by this blonde boy. It's important that he's blonde, who otherwise seems to be Indian, and takes it upon herself to teach him how to read, to demonstrate to him that the clay idol he was worshiping can be broken if she just smashes it on the floor, and converts him. And his first impulse is then to convert his bearer, his foster father. And then, of course, the boy gets sick and dies. And on his deathbed, successfully converts the bearer. And the last words of the story are, little children in India, go and do remember little Henry and go and do likewise. So it's similarly, Talia, it's similarly like this children's story that is absolutely designed to inculcate a kind of passion for, in this case, missionary empire in its child readers. And it was like a staple of nurseries. So, and it was often the first sort of imaginative contact British children would have had with the idea of India, right, in the first half of the 19th century. So anyway, in that story, it seems to me that the British child in India is totally vulnerable to sort of adoption and religious conversion and cultural assimilation in ways that have to be prevented. But then the preventing of them in the child catalyzes the kind of conversion impulse that is then empire itself, right? So it seems like there's this awareness of vulnerability that immediately gets sort of flipped into, we're going to pass through that danger and then, come out on the other side stronger than ever.
You do wonder, thinking about vulnerability, whether readers were aware that any child in a novel who was called Little Blank was not going to make it, right? Little Henry, Little Nell, Little Eva, Little Dick and David Copperfield. It's such a bad prognostic sign. Don't get attached. This child is not long for this world. I just want to say one other comment about vulnerability, and this is moving later, again, to the time of the movement to bring down infant mortality in the later 19th and early 20th century, which is that from the very beginning, one of the strands in that movement is definitely, we need healthy soldiers, right? In Britain in particular, the concern that when you bring in recruits, many children coming from poor families can't pass the physical, as we would say nowadays. And so that's part of the child welfare, reduce infant mortality movement, but so is the discourse of eugenics. And the people who want to bring down infant mortality from the very beginning and consistently have to defend themselves against those who say the babies who die at birth are the weaklings. If you save them, what will happen to our quote unquote stock? So that discourse of vulnerability, weakness, and health is part and parcel of the conversation, of the argument, medically, but also politically and socially, right from the beginning in a host of really interesting ways.
Just to add one note to that, Jay Dolmage has a book on Ellis Island about the way that Ellis Island, the doctors at Ellis Island developed ways of cataloging immigrants in order to sort of ascribe disability to them and to say that they were not capable of functioning in the United States. And so they invented categories like the moron, which had not previously apparently been a category. And if I'm remembering what Dolmage says correctly, what characterizes a moron is that they can pass, that they're bright and talkative and seems smart and alert. And so it takes a special medical eugenic gaze to recognize why they can't be let in. So yeah, absolutely. So just echoing what Perry says, and you can read about it in Dolmage's book.
Thank you guys so much. I'm going to start reading public questions as well. So this one is from Yvonne. She writes, your book, which of course I haven't read it yet, deals with middle-class motherhood. Does it inform us about working-class motherhood? Thinking of my great-grandmother who actually gave birth in Stevenage workhouse.
So the primary focus is on middle-class mothers because that's who the advice literature was clearly aimed at, and that was sort of my starting point in thinking about this. Where I think about working-class mothers a good bit in the 5th chapter, where I'm thinking about opium, in part because mid-century sort of nascent public health officials and sociologists were looking at the conditions of life among the working classes in Manchester and Birmingham and the other newly industrialized cities, and were horrified and blamed the working class, the women who were working outside the home, and in their journalism created, and then in parliamentary investigations, created the perception that there was a sort of direct connection between women who were working outside the home in factories and infant mortality and infants' addiction to opium. Melanie Reynolds has a great historical study that completely complicates and troubles all of that, including the fact that a lot of many working class women were not, in fact, working in factories after they had children. So it really disrupts a lot of the classist assumptions about what life was like. That said, we know that infant and child mortality was much higher in cities. It was much higher among the poor. There are all sorts of things like that where some of what I'm talking about in terms of concerns or anxieties of the middle class would would have been, the dangers would have been experienced completely differently by members of the working class, because with much greater intensity. But also in a sense without some of the, I think, the luxury of worrying about it and experiencing this anxious position. Part of my interest is how I think it, I think often, and I feel like it's a somewhat problematic truism in Victorian studies, but sort of what's happening in the middle class then sort of normalizes to other classes and groups, in part because that's the class that is writing and being written for in terms of sort of the dissemination of print culture. I guess I'll just say that one of my archival struggles with the book was all of the women I couldn't know. Like, I can't know the Indian servants, I can't know the nannies and wet nurses who were typically working class women. Like, they don't leave records, so it's much harder to sort of add their experiences into the collection of things that I can look at. There aren't genres of those in the same kind of way to sort of place in the genre ecology.
I also wanted to ask about this kind of central claim about maternal anxiety and the a priori fact of motherhood as caregiving. So that the fact that to be a mother is to worry to excess, and that care is synonymous with worry. Dreyer puts it this way: maternal anxiety is an essential affective component of patriarchal capitalism, engineering its production and reproduction through genres and generations. So I'm particularly interested in thinking about maternal anxiety in caregiving in light of Talia's recent work, but I'm also interested in thinking about how care, both medical and otherwise, can be theorized outside of anxiety, and to the degree in which anxiety is synonymous with care.
Yeah, so the thing about care is it's easy to get it mixed up with caring, and they're actually quite different. Caring is a feeling, care is an action. So we've all given care without having the feeling, right? So anytime if you've been a babysitter, or you've been hired to be an aide or give care to somebody else who may be a stranger, and those of us who teach, you walk into a room and the first day of class and you have never met these students before, there's no way you can feel that caring for them because they're strangers. But by offering care over and over again as a repeated action, it's performative. It generates the feeling of affection, so that if nothing goes wrong, very soon you start feeling affection for those students and you start really caring about them. If you have babysat, like as a teenager or something, you might not know the kid, you start feeling affection for them by dint of taking care of them. Anxiety doesn't have to be linked to caring or to caregiving. It could be a separate thing. And so, I don't think there's anything natural or inevitable about being an anxious mother. Anybody who gives care, from therapists to doctors to really to teachers, anybody can feel anxiety about what they're doing, whether or not they feel the affection. They can feel anxiety whether they're doing it well or not, whether their boss is going to catch them out, whether they're going to be recognized and get promoted, whether it's going to work. There are lots of reasons for having anxiety, but they don't necessarily have to come out of loving the person deeply that you are giving care to. So maybe I just think it might be helpful to kind of disaggregate those three things: anxiety and love and caregiving. And the definition of care that I use is meeting another's need. So medical is obviously a big example of that, but teaching and parenting are two other big examples of it. And some care theorists have argued that we're in relations of care all the time, that constitutes our entire social fabric. So like if you go into a store and you're buying something, I'm imagining like no masks, I'm imagining the before times. You could just go in and buy things, and you have a little like back and forth with the cashier, and the cashier has met your need by giving you change. You've met the cashier's need by kind of making eye contact and saying something, so you're not regarding them as like a machine. That's a little care exchange. So anyway, that's my take on it. I don't know, other people might have different perspectives on it.
Well, I'm here representing a profession that if you you would probably assign a fair degree of anxiety to, correct? If I were offering you the choice of two medical providers and I said, you know, this one really worries, you know, is really anxious. This one never seems to worry. Which one would you choose for yourself, your parent, your child?
You know, that is true. But then on the other hand, you have therapists who are worried about countertransference and who are trying sort of not to have that feeling. So anxiety can get in the way. Over-identification can get in the way, or it could be the sign of doing really good work.
I think part of how I was thinking about the juxtaposition that I play with a little bit with care and concern was that part of what I'm interested in the book is the way maternal care as action, the way Talia is defining it, gets defined in terms of these kinds of anticipatory and spatial paying attention, right? So there's something about maternal care, caring as the, well, giving care, is this paying attention and this sort of getting caught up in this motion. I don't think it's necessary that it collapse into anxiety in the way it seems to around the particular maternal subject position. I think that's another sort of, so there's a motion or a movement, but then there's also the way through the genre ecology that movement is getting attached in for this particular subject position to this experience of suspense and anxiety and so on. So the care and concern get conflated and become a sort of their own sort of unit, right? And that's part of what I was really interested in, is that actually I think in the case of maternal subjectivity, in the case of the maternal subject formation and cultural formation, that really has happened and they've gotten collapsed into one another. But it's not, again, it's sort of not inevitable. It's happening through the circulation of these particular genres and around this particular rhetorical situation of motherhood.
Yeah, that's exactly what I thought was so valuable here. That to be a mother doesn't mean you have to be concerned or anxious. Those two things are not necessarily linked. And you're showing us the rhetorical mechanism by which they became linked. But also just to remind everybody, sorry, some background noise there. Just to remind everybody about that painting that you showed at the beginning. I was thinking about the servant there who is formally in this place of the father who's missing from that scene. And you asked rightly, like, what is she feeling? What is her concern about? What is her care about? You know, who is she caring for? So thinking about the form of care you might give as a paid governess or nurse or servant, where you might be giving the same kind of caregiving, but you might or might not feel concern or affection, or it might be of slow growth, or you might feel resentment, like in Agnes Grey, you know, she doesn't like the kids.
I have a follow-up question here from Sharon Friedman. Sharon asks, if we think of care as related to responsibility, isn't there anxiety of our ability to fulfill that responsibility?
I mean, it doesn't have to be related to responsibility, I don't think. Thinking about the maid or the servant, the governess, they don't, what is the responsibility? I don't know if a 19th century subject would have defined herself as having a responsibility in that way. I mean, a mother might have been taught to think of herself as responsible. I don't know, I was just teaching John Halifax Gentlemen this afternoon, and they learn that they're about to have a child, and they're all overwhelmed that God has granted them a soul to bring up in the right ways. It's entirely a religious anxiety. There isn't any medical anxiety yet. The child is then born and turns out to be blind, and there is a medical anxiety at that point. I'm sorry I'm ruining the novel if you haven't read it, but not really. And she's not little anything, so I won't say anything about that. But the anxiety and the responsibility there are about having a Christian duty to bring up this child in the right way, and not any other kind of responsibility.
I think also one of the things the advice literature was doing was it was really it was associating anxiety and responsibility sort of relentlessly, because it was particularly in the almost every single book, gross generalization, but a lot of the books had these prefaces where one piece of it was basically your kid is almost certainly going to die, and it's probably because you didn't know enough. And so that's a real sort of a really brutal move, right? And it's a marketing ploy, and it's also there was things that medical science was figuring out at that time and needed to communicate. So like there's basis there in some ways, but also it's just brutal. But I think it's also attaching responsibility for physical care and longevity to these other factors, to this, statistical and felt likelihood that the kid was going to die or at least come very close to death. And this was part of what you, as the mother, needed to be preventing.
We live in the residue of all of those countless uptakes.
Absolutely. I was thinking back to our discussion about infant mortality and displaced anxiety since infant mortality has gone down. And I think one of the residues that we find there is a kind of did my child achieve the good life? Did I do a good enough job producing this child? And that becomes a kind of moral failing in a certain sense. I also wanted to ask, though, about temporality, which Talia and Dara talked about. And temporality is one of the larger foci of the book, and anxiety seems to offer a particularly complex and exponentially widening sense of time and its consequences. So I was wondering if the panel would speak more to the shape of anxiety as a temporal structure, and also the way in which anxiety, when reading this advice literature, its relationship, but also the way it might look similar to what we talk about in terms of the language of uptake and of our encounter with texts.
I mean, I guess I'll start by saying that I felt as though there are moments when you're working on a book where it starts to seem as though everything you're seeing is just like everything else you're seeing, right? And so all of the structures are kind of homologous to one another. And that was certainly true with exactly that question, where as I'm thinking about, and the way I define the temporality of anxiety in terms of something that is experienced as something is coming closer, but on the basis of previous experience, that felt like it was almost too close to some of the ways I understand genre and uptake, in that a genre is providing certain, in Dylan's phrase, uptake affordances that are sort of making certain things possible, but it's also based on what comes, like it all felt like the logic was the same. And there were moments when I had to pause and be like, wait, I need these different things because they're doing different things, right? And that's actually where, Dylan, your disambiguating uptake actually really helped me, because it was sort of teasing out the different pieces of that. So it wasn't all one movement that was exactly like anxiety. Yeah, I guess.
So I would, and this is a vocabulary which I may not use as well as I should, but I would suggest that one of the joys of pediatrics as a medical field, one of the joys of early childhood education, is that children embody a certain trajectory. The child is always going to be a different child in a month, going to be a different child in a year, going to be the idea of a future of development, of time and change is kind of built in, say, when we, in a way that it is not, I mean, it is also in partly in adult medicine, although often the changes are eventually going to involve debility and deterioration, but in working with children, either as a medical practitioner or as a teacher or as a governess, there is some built-in trajectory of time and change. And I guess one of the things that I think about with uptake is consider the difference between the experience, say, as the parent of a newborn in reading one of the articles that we've been referencing on, you and your child and what you should do, and the experience of reading it before you're a parent, or most more likely not reading it.
It seems to me that anxiety would be recursive as a temporal formation. You're just obsessing over something. You can't sleep. You're just thinking of it over and over again. And in that sense, it's in really interesting tension with that kind of linear progress that Perry is talking about, where the child is going to age out of the thing that you're obsessing about. By the time you figure out breastfeeding versus formula, the child's onto solids, so I would think of the temporality of anxiety as being a kind of closed loop of repetition myself.
I have a question here from Greg Vargo as well. He writes, I think of anxiety for children today, getting into the right schools, for example, as related to precarity and the hollowing out of certain kinds of social services, like free or low-cost tuition at CUNY campuses. Thoughts on reading that structure of feeling backwards, relating class anxieties about children's well-being?
So I don't know about precarity precisely. I do feel like there's a really important, that part of the reason this happened at this moment was about the rise of the middle class, and the middle class as, and some of the changes around assumptions about family and the purpose of family almost that were happening at the same time. So that part of the job of the family in middle class ideology is to transmit social identity to the next generation. And that's understood as performative and requiring what we now understand as intensive parenting. It's understood as requiring work. Prior to that, it wasn't really this thing that might or might not happen. Like your children were going to sort of inherit their place, your place, and there wasn't the same kind of belief that you could shape them morally, educationally, but also that you had to shape them in order to make sure that they reproduced at either the same level or the next level up. So I think, Greg, I think there's a perception of precarity in that sort of inherently that I think is existing in the first half of the 19th century, I think is existing both alongside and then getting exacerbated by some of the sort of economic boom and bust cycles, whereby a family in the 1840s, for sure, could find itself very quickly in a different kind of position, and the children in a different kind of position than had been anticipated. And so there was I think it's connected to all of that in a way that, again, I think, as Dylan said a moment ago, we're living in the residues of that. We're living in the uptake residues of that. I'm not sure it's quite the same. Yeah, but I think the kind of precarity I'm thinking about is maybe a little different.
I also have a question here about, do we see a link between Victorian maternal anxiety and Victorian customs about death, such as mourning jewelry or death portraits?
I mean, I'm not sure that mourning jewelry and the sort of arts connected with death, like hair jewelry, come out of anxiety. I think they come out of just a different attitude towards death, that death occurred in the domestic home and everybody had seen dead bodies and there was a lot of death and, everybody knew people who had died. And in some ways it was actually the mourning was integrated into ordinary life in a much more kind of profound way than we do today, where a lot of dying happens in institutions behind walls or curtains. People don't see it, may not have the rituals to deal with it. And I think that the mourning jewelry isn't really coming out of anxiety, but out of remembrance. So maybe it's again a temporality thing, an idea that you have a part of the beloved who's not quite gone and who stays with you and who you are in intimate contact with. Your own body is in intimate contact with and is enhanced by and is ornamented by the lost person who's not quite lost, because that physical material element of that person remains.
I think there's also, there was a sort of religious formulation of what heaven was like and going to heaven that made it similarly sort of domesticated and nearby, that I think is connected to what Talia is saying. So in Catherine Tate's memoir, in which she recounts the death of 5 of her 7 children over the course of 6 weeks from scarlet fever, one of the things she's imagining as after the first couple of daughters have died, as other children are dying, is that they are going to join their siblings. And it's really clear, I mean, it's explicitly, they're going from their home here to their home in heaven. And so, and it seems like it's actually a very comforting notion because it keeps them closer. So I think that was another kind of the proximity and the intimacy with death was also sort of enabled ways of finding comfort in sort of imagined or physical ongoing connection with the deceased.
Thank you so much. So we have time for one more question before we go. And I just wanted to ask, we've talked about it really this whole time because it's one of the centerpieces of the book, Darren, that's your archive. And I just wanted to kind of address it more head on. I want to ask about the materiality of this advice literature. And can you just speak a little bit more as to like this genre and your reason for thinking of it as so central to the development of this kind of affective cultural structure of feeling?
So I came to advice literature because I was trying to understand some stuff about British women's experience of motherhood in India. And Nupur Chaudhuri, the historian Nupur Chaudhuri, referenced an advice book for mothers in India written by a white physician in Calcutta. And I was digging around for that and stumbled across others and was curious. And so started reading them. And then, and I was struck by the brutality that I was talking about earlier, about the even as I just picked up 1 or 2 of these, I was like, holy crap, like that really sucks. That got me curious, and I started working with one in particular by Pi Henry Chavez, and just sort of got curious and tracing its kind of publication history and that kind of thing. But then sort of kept going back to this moment and trying to learn more about, did these exist in the 18th century? What did they look like in the 18th century? And sort of reading around. And then it was just like, yeah, I kept being curious and trying to figure out what to say about these books and how to understand them. And at the same time, was really interested in how in late 18th century children's literature, like that of Mariah Edgeworth, the mother is a really authoritative, confident, educating figure. And yet by the 1840s and late 1830s, you have this mother figure who is able to provide moral influence, but not have exert the same kind of authority. And so that made it seem to me as though something had changed, right? Something had changed in those 50 years. And yeah, I kept going from there. Research is funny and fun.
Thank you so much. So now I just want to call back Molly Rogers, and I want to thank the whole panel for their participation and such an illuminating conversation. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Joe. And thank you, Dylan, Perry, Talia. Thank you all very much for being with us tonight. And thank you, Dreyer Regaignon, for a marvelous book, Writing Maternity, Medicine, Anxiety, Rhetoric, and Genre. I also want to thank the Medical History Working Group for their co-sponsorship of the event, which I neglected to mention earlier. If you missed any part of this event, we will be releasing the recording on our YouTube channel within a couple of weeks. You will all receive an email once it is available. Thank you all for joining us, and have a wonderful evening.